we talk about the limits of morality, it's good to bring up the context of war, violence, massacre. There is the argument that when we've talked about this, we talked about this with Confucius and Aristotle and virtue ethics. We talked about what happens when society breaks down. And there are no rules. Purportedly, there are no rules. Perhaps there is a way to make sense of conflict and violence and war, and maybe ethics, morality is still applicable, but we'll have to see. We'll have to see. There are a variety of opinions on that, of course. So, I'd like to start with a quote. Thus it comes about that all armed prophets have conquered. The unarmed ones, well, not so much. This, of course, comes from Machiavelli. Machiavelli, who actually was a fan of republicanism, but is associated most clearly with the view we refer to as realpolitik, political realism. And of course, when we think about the moral responses to violence and war, there are a variety of philosophical positions we can take or explore. And I'm going to reduce that down to 4. And this is a simplification, of course. Anytime we do this, anytime we try to classify or, designate or delineate, we're going to simplify. But I think there are 4 general approaches to war and violence and the ethics of war and violence, and they fall into the following categories: political realism, realpolitik, just war theory, political liberalism, idealism, and then pacifism. Political realism sees war as a tool, as an instrument. Some really morality, ideology, none of that, is important. That war is inevitable. It's baked into the system in a way, baked into our nature, probably. And so states go to war, and that's just the thing they do. Just war theory says that war might be inevitable, but it is bad, and the negative consequences of war can be ameliorated through applying certain rules, like distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. And then perhaps it will be easier for us to reestablish, after the conflict, to reestablish, the cooperation, cooperative systems. Political liberalism and idealism sees war maybe not as inevitable. In fact, there may be ways we can reduce war or reduce conflict or even eliminate conflict. We have to simply change the we have to change the incentives, and the best way to change the incentives to make the calculation of war too costly is to create an international system where it just doesn't make sense to go to war. And to a certain extent, we've been able to do that since World War II, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, there's pacifism, nonviolence. Hey, war is bad. Violence is bad. There's no way to justify it. There's no way to dress it up. Should be avoided. Can be avoided. Just say no, right? So these are the 4 categories. Again, very simplified categories that we're going to talk about today. So let's start with political realism. Realpolitik. States accumulate power to ensure their own security. The world is anarchic. Every state is on its own. And every state is going to use violence and coercive tactics to accomplish what they want to do. If it is in their interest to do so, they will do it. Sometimes, even if it isn't in their interest, they will do it, right? So they will pursue the national interest. States always act in their own interest. Whose other interest would they act for? Doesn't make any sense, right? There is no morality of war. Just isn't. War is just a continuation of politics, and politics is really about power. And so war is not always good. I mean, the realist is not going to say that war is good. It's just a thing. And we should be prepared for it when it occurs. It's not always productive. It doesn't always lead to, to the conclusions that we anticipated, to say the least. War can be unpredictable. It can be disastrous politically. So we should be very careful about waging war. But if we have to wage war, we wage war. I mean, it's not, morality is irrelevant. The morality of war is irrelevant, largely, right? Karl von Clausewitz, wrote one of the greatest treatises on war, maybe second only to General Sun Tzu in The Art of War, very famous treatise on war, and then probably the only thing that compares to it that I can think of is Mahan, and of course he was a naval strategist, so that Clausewitz is primarily thinking about land strategy. But I mean, very famously, Clausewitz says, "Look, war. There's nothing special about war. It's just a continuation of politics by other means." So war is not an isolated event, right? It's just a tool. It's a tool used by states to pursue political objectives. So during war, underlying political goals are always in play. Nothing changes. There's nothing that changes fundamentally about what the state is trying to accomplish. It's just now we're using violence, right? So military actions are just one way to pursue the goals of a state. Again, they can be better or worse, right? Sometimes we use diplomacy. Sometimes we use bribery. Sometimes we threaten. Sometimes we trick. Sometimes we kill to get what we want. And this, of course, brings up the question, well, what is politics ultimately about? And the answer to that is just very clear from a realist perspective. Politics is about power. It can't be any more obvious, right? Politics is about power. And so the question is, when we think about war as a tool, as an instrument of state power, why should we go to war? Clear answer. We'll be better off. We'll be more powerful. And of course that calculation is uncertain. And if the answer is, well, no, then we shouldn't go to war. Not, that might not work out for us very well. What about morality? What about ideology? What about economic ideas? What about religion? No. From the realist perspective, all of these motivations are secondary to power. Now, there's overlap, but at bottom, after you peel away all those layers of religion, of ideology, of economics, all of that stuff, it's about power. So realists are highly skeptical of pursuing social and economic values at the expense of state power and ideology. You never do that, right? That's ridiculous. Why would you do that? Great example of political realist. Otto von Bismarck. Modern Germany is the creation of this guy. like many places, I mean, we think about the rise of the nation state, and like many places around the globe, Germany was just a chaotic, a chaotic area of independent territories, quasi-independent territories. Otto von Bismarck unified Germany, created our modern idea of Germany. How did he do that? Well, he's often cited as a classic example of realpolitik, right? Now, he used nationalism, this idea of the nation, right? This idea of the people. He used that. And that's a great, as we're going to find out when we talk about populism and we talk about fascism, that is a very motivating tool. That's the idea of that, we are a people, we are a unified people, that, we have history and we're connected to the blood and the soil and all of that. It's a powerful idea. And of course, one of the defining characteristics of fascism is ultranationalism. This idea that, the people, the Volk, the fatherland, the motherland is more important than I am. And in fact, I am nothing, without this connection to the history and the soil and all of that, right? It's a powerful, motivating idea. Well, Bismarck used nationalism, but he didn't really believe in it. He wasn't really a nationalist. I mean, you read about him. He says he's filled with these contradictions, but really, there's a unity to everything that he does. So he uses nationalism as a motivating tool, but he doesn't, he's not invested in it personally. He did fight wars when they were advantageous. Like, he did not hesitate to use war, but he didn't rely on war, right? He wasn't a militarist. He didn't see war as an end in itself, or, the martial virtues of the state, or whatever that, we associate sometime today with the various forms of authoritarianism. War is just a tool for him. He didn't glorify war for its own sake. He actually introduced progressive social reforms. Not a lot of people know that about Bismarck, but it's true. A welfare state. Why did he do that? Was he concerned about the people? He was not. He did not care about social justice. What did he care about? Making the state stronger, reducing political instability. And he would do whatever it took to accomplish that goal. And he would shift his alliances and his policies when it suited his goals, when it was convenient. And that really is, you think about political pragmatism. The architectonic political pragmatist, Otto von Bismarck, right? Political realist. That's what realism looks like in action. Ideology, no. Economics, no. Religion, no. Nationalism, no. I mean, all of those things are in play, but all of those things are in service of increasing state power, right? And think about it. Think about this. I want you to think about this clearly, right? Imagine you're a political leader, and it doesn't matter what type of system, it doesn't matter what nation. It doesn't matter if it's an autocracy, if it's an oligarchy, if you're a prime minister, if you're a president of a democracy. Doesn't matter. None of that really matters. But you are a leader, right? What is your number one priority? More important than anything else? Yeah, Hector.
Do you mean like what I would do if I was a leader.
Okay, yeah, what would you do if you were a leader? What would you care about? What would be the thing that would be most important to you?
I will say education. I will try to lower costs or
Okay,
invest more money in
I
education.
love that. Like, great. Yeah, that'd be your number one priority. Let me ask you this question, Hector. How are you going to do that if you don't have power?
I mean, as citizens, is that a question?
No, if you're a leader, if you're a political leader, and let's say you're obsessed with education and you want to make great schools and great universities. How do you get that done? What do you need to get that done?
I'll say money
Yeah,
and
you
a
need
lot of
money, you need
influence,
support, you need power to do that.
power.
Yeah. So you could be a saint. You could care about the people. You could care about education. If you don't have power, you accomplish nothing. So in fact, Hector, if you really do care about education, you're going to have to figure out a way to get power and to keep it because that's the only way you're going to accomplish your goals. And this is what I want you to understand. It doesn't matter what your goals are. Your number one priority as a leader is to get power and to keep power. Because if you don't have power, you can accomplish nothing. Do you see that, Hector?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's your number one priority. Doesn't matter if you're a president or prime minister or a dictator or a tyrant. Doesn't matter. Your agenda is the same. And you're going to be supported by, could be a small cabal of generals or oligarchs, or you could be democratically elected and have a large constituency, but you're going to have to figure out a way to make those people happy and to support them. And you're going to have to direct resources towards them to stay in power. Because if you can't stay in power, you're not going to be able to accomplish anything you want. And so this is one reason why you see countries that have natural endowments like oil or diamonds or something like that, and they're still poor. Why? Because in order for the leader to stay in power, he has to extract those resources and distribute those resources to his supporters or her supporters. Hector?
Yeah, I had another like a thought regarding that. I was
Yeah.
thinking, are there specific ways or methods to get power? One of
Yes.
those I was thinking right now was
Of
maybe
course.
through
Yeah.
fear.
Absolutely. And what it comes down to from the realist perspective is anything you have to do. Now, okay? So here's the other thing about politics, and this is why people don't like politics. It'd be great. Oh, TJ, are you here? You said what kind of power? Power is simply the ability to make people do what you want, whether they want to or not. That's all it is. Being able to impose your will. And in Hector's case, Hector says, we want to build schools. Well, you make people build schools. That's power, right? Now, how do we get power? Well, the realist says, any way you can. Any way you can. Doesn't matter. And so let's say again you're a saint and you always tell the truth and you always do the right thing, but your opponent is stabbing people in the back, murdering people. Well, look, okay, you're not likely to last long in that conflict unless you're willing to get your hands dirty. And so this, of course, brings us to Machiavelli, right? This, of course, brings us to Machiavelli. And Machiavelli is an interesting thinker because his sympathies were Republican. He was in Italy. He was in Florence, and Florence had a republic, and he participated in that government. And there was a powerful Italian banking family called the Medicis, and they essentially destroyed the Republic and took power. And Machiavelli, he was kind of forced into exile for a while, but he came back and he was trying to ingratiate himself with the Medicis. And so he wrote The Prince. And The Prince is this realpolitik guide. And it tells you how a prince can get power and keep power. And so the question comes up in The Prince, should political leaders act morally? Should they be moral? Should they be moral people? And Machiavelli has an answer. Machiavelli says, no, absolutely not. No, no. That's the worst. That you don't want the person who is afraid to lie, who is afraid to deceive, who is afraid to use violence. You don't want that person protecting you. That's not the person who's made for politics. So, great quote here. When the safety of one's country wholly depends on the decision to be taken, no attention should be paid to either justice or injustice, to kindness or cruelty, or to its being praiseworthy or ignominious. Forget about all that. Like if you can't get your hands dirty, politics is not for you. Because somebody's going to eat your lunch. And that's just the way it is. Right? And if you aren't willing to do whatever it takes to maintain the safety of the state, well, why are you there? What good are you to us? Even the people, right? So Machiavelli teaches that it's good, of course, for a leader to appear to be moral or virtuous. They should go to church. Absolutely. Yeah. They should be seen in church every Sunday. But when it comes down to it, politics makes you do things that you're not proud of. So sometimes it's necessary to act against mercy, against faith, against humanity, against frankness, against religion in order to preserve the state. And that's what you need to do to preserve the state and preserve your power. So you should be capable of using violence. Absolutely.
So, I guess he wouldn't have been a Christian for sure.
Oh
But
yeah, no, he's absolutely Christian. Yeah,
so from what I understand, Jesus was the greatest leader and has the most followers.
yeah.
And he did not, this is the opposite of everything what he stood for. So like saying, so maybe there is another way, but because this seems deceptive and that wouldn't be rightly aligned.
Okay, Najib, I want you to think about the history of the church in Europe and how the church spread its power on the back of a sword.
Yes.
Right. It's the same with Islam, right? You look at early Islam and the early caliphates, same thing. Why were those religions successful? A lot of bodies were stacked up. Okay, so yeah, no, I mean, it's horror. Is it horrifying? Is it shocking? I mean, yes. I'm just trying. I'm explaining to you the position. I'm not advocating this. I'm not saying,
Right.
oh, you should. This is political realism, and Machiavelli is a Christian, but he's a realist.
Okay.
So, I mean, yeah, I guess you could go to a monastery or something and be a monk and be, practice all of these virtues that Jesus talked about, or you could get power in the real world and spread Jesus's word, but you're going to do that on the back of a sword.
Well, I guess more like of getting that power and back to like Hector's question and winning the people.
Yes, it's
When you
great.
have all the people, then you have all the power because you can influence them to do what you want them to do when they need to do it. And it in the scripture it does say there is a time for killing, but uh
Yeah,
I
whenever it's
think
convenient. I mean, that's politics, right?
Yeah.
I mean, okay, so do we have this discussion about the relationships between politics and religion all the time? And it's
Hmm.
going on right now, right? Like what is okay and what is not okay?
Right.
Well, I mean, the realist says in politics, religion can be useful, but I mean, do have to motivate people sometimes, but people can be motivated by love and they can also be motivated by fear. And Machiavelli will say, it's great to be loved. It's good if the people love you. But you know what's even better than that? They fear you. Okay. I'm so, I sometimes, I'm like, oh, sometimes this is like the first time students have like been exposed to Machiavelli or these ideas. And sometimes I forget like how impactful they are, right? But you have to live in this world with your eyes open, Nadia, right? And many people hold this view, right?
Well, sure. It seems to be the overarching view right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So
So yeah,
yeah, I
everything that you just said, like show up for church, hold a Bible, or do some things, and then
yeah,
just be a tyrant and make
yeah.
people do what you want them to do. But
Not saying
again,
that.
historically,
Yeah,
there with that comes resentment also,
yes,
and a lot of those leaders have been offed or after a period, you know.
very true, very true. And so, again, we want to think about this, and so, like, look, ideally, the political realist would say, I mean, the political realist is not saying, oh, always use violence. The political realist says sometimes you may have to, and you should be ready to, but if there's a better way, you should do that. But you're not motivated by religion or ideology or economics or anything other than the keeping power. And that's really what politics is all about. Because if you don't have power, you can't get anything done. Right. Um, in the Mahabharata, the story of this great cycle of war between the Pandava and the Kurava, right? And we talked about the Gita and we talked about Arjuna, I think, a little bit before. But the gods favor the Pandava, right? Because they're righteous and they're moral warriors, like Arjuna, who's a moral person and he doesn't like the killing and he doesn't like the violence. And but the Pandava are outnumbered by their adversaries. And so they talk about resorting to trickery and stratagems. And many of the Pandava warriors say, no, this is not right. That we should stand and fight like men and warriors and be honorable. And the gods have to intervene and say, what are you talking about? You know, you should not mind the fact that your enemy has been killed deceitfully. As long as your cause is righteous, right? When one is outnumbered by his enemies, then destruction should be brought about by stratagem. The gods themselves, in killing the Asuras, have followed the same methods. That way may be followed by all. And we have been crowned with success. And so even the gods themselves, when they struggled with these great titanic beings, the Asuras, used trickery and deceit. So but of course there is a moral sense in the Mahabharata that the cause of the Pandavas is righteous cause. But if you're fighting for the good, then do what you have to do to win. I mean, there's no second place. You don't get a participation trophy for second place. You know what you get? You get killed. Okay? So when it comes down to it, do whatever it takes. No participation trophies in war. No, like nobody's going to come and say, oh, you fought a good fight and pat you on the back because you'll be dead. What about international law? Okay, the international system from the realist perspective is anarchic. There is international law, but those laws can't be enforced by any central power because there is no central power. There is no power to enforce these laws. There is no state capable of regulating, everyone else's interactions. There just isn't. And so states participate in the international system only to the degree that they're committed to it, because there's no higher authority. So states do whatever they want to do. Realists see the international system existing in a state of constant antagonism, because states tend to pursue their own interest and they strive to attain as many resources as possible. And that's a recipe for conflict, isn't it? Right? That's a recipe for conflict. Why do nations comply with international law then? Well, they do so only if it's in their self-interest to do so. And the moment it stops being in their self-interest, they stop cooperating. Now, does this mean that war is always good? No. Sometimes war can be disastrous. War is dangerous. It's unpredictable as an instrument of politics. It should be avoided when it can, not for moral reasons, but because it's unpredictable. And anyone who's ever seen a fight, sometimes you know that the person you thought was going to win, they don't win because things happen. You can have all of the advantages and still things happen, right? War can leave a state in a less advantageous position. So you should be very, very careful about when you use it. Once those tanks roll across the border, you don't know what's going to happen. Just because you're numerically superior doesn't mean you're going to win. And here we can look to the example of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. It was supposed to be a very short war. They were going to roll over Kiev and install whatever government that. No, that's not what happened at all. And now that's the third year of conflict, and it's been disastrous for Russia. So the political realists would object to this conflict not because Putin was immoral. I mean, Russia has legitimate, from a realist perspective, Russia's borders are indefensible. And so territorial expansion makes sense. But you should only do that if you're going to win, and they're not winning. So from a realist perspective, this was a mistake. Not morally, but strategically. It's not good because the Russia's weaker than it was when it started the war. You never want that. Okay, problems with political realism. A major problem with political realism is the security dilemma. And this is a situation where actions by one state intended to heighten its own security, such as increasing its military strength or making alliances, can lead other states to respond with similar measures. So, really good example of this is during the Cold War. The United States was afraid of the Soviet Union, so we built a lot of missiles. The Soviets saw us building those missiles. What did they do?
Build more missiles.
They built more missiles. And so when, oh my God, now the Soviets are building missiles. What did we do? We built more missiles. They built more missiles. Everybody's less secure. Right? So this produces increased tensions, which can create or exacerbate the conflict, even when neither side really wants to go to war. And we see examples of this historically. World War I was a really good example of this. the battleship race between Germany and Great Britain, where Germany was challenging Great Britain on the seas, or the alliances that were being made. And these were seen as very provocative actions. And there was a response, and it spiraled out of control into war. The Cold War, of course, a very good example of this. If we look at the tension between India and Pakistan, we see this. If we look at the tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia, we see this. And of course, theoretically speaking, if the Iranians developed a nuclear weapon, just theoretically, the predictable response to that would be that the Saudis would obtain a nuclear weapon as well, and everybody would be less safe. And this is the security dilemma. Now, a nightmare scenario that can come out of the security dilemma is called the Hobbesian trap. And so here you have two powers locked in an arms race, and one power recognizes that it can't keep up. And so fear of being overwhelmed leads to a preemptive strike. Because I'll just tell you, there's always an advantage to striking first. And that's in an ordinary fist fight or in a world war, right? There's always an advantage to hitting first. And so sometimes if you think, this is not working out in our favor, these other guys are building more weapons. Hey, if we're going to survive, we have to strike now. And that's a nightmare scenario. And of course, there are historical precedents for this. We've seen this. This is exactly what happened in the 1967 war between Israel and Syria and Egypt and Jordan. All of those countries, the Arab countries, were posturing. They didn't really want conflict, but they were posturing and trying to intimidate. And the Israelis said, we're going to be overwhelmed, and so we have to strike first. And that's exactly what happened. And it was disastrous for the Arabs. The Cold War has many examples of this. There were times during the Cold War when, the Soviets thought that the United States, during the Able Archer exercises, I think it was in 1983, the Soviets thought, well, there was a military exercise by NATO, and the Soviets for a moment thought that NATO was getting ready to hit them. And so they contemplated, launching first. Right? So it happens. Also, realpolitik neglects other motivations. I mean, is everything really only about power? Look, states' actions may be driven by deeply held beliefs, domestic political pressures, nationalistic ideology, religion. I mean, religion is not always a pretext. Some people take it very seriously, right? Or the desire to achieve specific goals beyond power security. So political realism, by reducing everything to just questions of power, I think oversimplifies these conflicts in a way that is distortive. Realists also don't recognize moral limits on armed conflict, and this is very disturbing. Because if there really aren't any rules, then anything goes, right? Including, the bombing of civilian targets. And of course, the utilitarians will justify this. And we've talked about this when we talked about utilitarianism, the bombing of Dresden or the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But there's an argument to be made that this is crossing the line, that even in times of war, you should not target civilian populations. A really good example of this, or a horrifying example of this, is the My Lai massacre. And this, I think, occurred in 1968, where U.S. forces were in Vietnam. And there was a U.S. unit that was assigned with pacifying a territory that was a hotbed of insurgent action by the Viet Cong. And it was thought that there were several villages that were actively supporting the Viet Cong, and U.S. soldiers went in and just killed everyone. And this, of course, was a war crime. But the people that participated in this massacre said, look, we were given orders. They were lawful orders, and we did what we thought we had to do. Now, I mean, the political realist would say, yeah, this kind of thing is inevitable, but I think this is morally reprehensible. Maybe there are some lines that should never be crossed. What about terrorism? Very concerned with terrorism. The world very concerned with terrorism. Particularly since the 9/11 attacks. Can terrorism ever be morally justified? Terrorism, by the way, is the unlawful use or threatened use of force, violence against civilians to achieve political, religious, or ideological objectives. So directly targeting civilians, avoiding military confrontation by hitting the enemy where they're weakest, civilian infrastructure, gatherings, buses, that kind of things, hotels. Now, for the realist, terrorism is just another type of tool. Asymmetric warfare is just another tool. It's not morally distinct from any other type of warfare. In fact, you can make an argument for terrorism. Asymmetrical warfare might be the best strategy if you're the weaker party. If you lack the resources to wage a conventional war, if you don't have tanks, if you don't have aircraft carrier or jet fighters, hey, you can always make a bomb out of fertilizer and park it next to a football stadium. And that's completely legitimate, right? From a realist perspective. Terrorism in a way is just a psychological thing. It's not, I mean, terrorist attacks usually have very little military significance. They're like even think of the 9/11 attacks, with the exception of the attack on the Pentagon. I mean, they had almost no effect on the U.S. military. So what's the whole purpose of terrorism? Well, this gets back to, I think, what one of the things that Nadja was talking about, psychology. The real aim is psychological manipulation of a population. So that population will be afraid, and maybe they will pressure their government into making concessions. This could be a very effective tool, right? You could see why groups would want to engage in terrorism. Because it could pressure populations or manipulate populations into pressuring their government, right? Now, has terrorism ever been effective? Yeah, it has. The Irish Republican Army was a paramilitary movement dedicated to freeing Ireland from British rule. And this is in contrast to what Gandhi and the Indians and the Indians did against the British. The IRA used violence. They used violence against both military and civilian targets. Now, they did fail to create a fully united Ireland. They did fail in that goal, but they did help create an Irish Free State. Michael Collins was an IRA leader. Very, very interesting person, and there's a pretty good film on him, on his life. The National Liberation Front in Algeria successfully directed the Algerian War of Independence against France using terrorism. So a realist assessment of these two movements, why were they successful? Well, the realist would say that these groups had a very good understanding of their enemy. They understood their enemy very well. Each group had clear political goals, and so the violence was an instrument in achieving those goals. Like Clausewitz said, they never lost sight of the political goal. They knew when to stop fighting. They knew when to start negotiating. They captured the constituent population. They had broad support. And when it came to time to negotiate, they were willing to make significant concessions in exchange for peace. And with those extremists who resisted negotiation, they were able to control them, sometimes through assassination. Now, what about Al-Qaeda or ISIS? And a lot of people very concerned about these groups today. Will they be successful? Well, if we compare them, the realist assessment would suggest that they will not be successful. Why? They didn't really understand the West when they attacked the West during the 9/11 attacks, and when Al-Qaeda did. ISIS, of course, developed after the fall of the Iraqi government when the U.S. left. Each group has vague or unrealistic goals. ISIS in particular wants to reestablish a caliphate. Not really clear what that means. Both groups see fighting as an end in itself. Both groups have alienated their constituent populations. Both are international outcasts. Both seem unwilling to negotiate, so there doesn't really seem to be a political agenda. And both groups are under the control of ideological extremists. In fact, the only thing we can say in their favor is that their attacks seem to have provoked an extreme overreaction by the West. And that's about the only thing they have going for them. Now, the reading, War and Massacre by Nagel. Nagel makes the case against realism and utilitarianism. Nagel is a moral absolutist. He argues for something akin to Kantian deontology. Nagel says even in times of violent conflict, there are rules, absolute rules. He claims that certain actions like harming non-combatants are just morally wrong. They should never be done. Even if it would lead to a quicker or more favorable outcome, you shouldn't do it. Nagel argues that some restrictions on warfare, such as protecting medical personnel and avoiding attacks on civilians, these aren't just arbitrary norms. They stem from the moral principle of respecting the inherent dignity and rights of individuals, even in the midst of conflict. So just because there's war doesn't mean there's a breakdown of the moral order. Hector.
I also wanted to add, maybe this could also be an example of that. What happened in Cuba with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. They did all that in order to promote education and all that kind of stuff, but still they did everything to get power.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, for you as an illustration of political realism. Yeah. Some would argue, and I don't want to take a position on this, but some would argue that that was done under the cloak of ideology. And particularly in the case of Castro and his brother, Guevara seemed to be a legitimate ideologue and of course sacrificed his life fighting in South America, right? But also was quite capable and murdered personally many people. So yeah, no, that's an excellent example, I think, of the realist illustration of power over ideology. And of course, I think that they would argue that you have to win in order to usher in the, the socialist or communist utopia that they promised. And if you don't win, then it's just a dream. So you have to do whatever it takes to win. And this is a common refrain. And it does, like I said, not just among, the vanguard of the proletariat, it's a common refrain among, neo-fascists or anyone who's involved in politics. If you don't win, you're not going to accomplish anything. There's no second place. There's no consolation prize in politics or war. Okay, so ultimately, Nagel admits that sometimes individuals may be conflicted when caught in war, and there may just not be any right thing to do. And so Nagel, it's a subtle piece. His analysis is subtle. It's well developed. And he does suggest that there may be times in conflict like this in which there just isn't any right thing to do. This, of course, brings us to just war theory. Nadja, I think you'll like this more. I hope you will. Just war theory is rooted in Catholic doctrine, medieval Catholic doctrine, and it puts limitations on how war can be conducted. It puts limitations on how we can wage war and when we can wage war. It is kind of also the basis for most rules of engagement among the developed nations. So, just war theory postulates the belief that war, while it is terrible, can be made less so with the right conduct. Under the right circumstances, waging war can be ethically conducted and ethically justified. Nations, like individuals, have an inherent right of self-defense. Additionally, a nation might go to war to protect innocent parties. So these are the two circumstances under which war is permissible, right? And I think here, part of the idea is looking at morality as cooperation as well, is thinking that, like, even if we are engaged in warfare, warfare is not a permanent state, and eventually we will go back to the norm, the cooperative norm, and the more morally we conduct ourselves during time of war, the easier it will be to repair the system and to get back to normal, right? And so rules matter. So there are criteria for going to war. There's the jus ad bellum and the jus in bello. The jus ad bellum tells us when we can go to war, and the jus in bello tells us how we must conduct ourselves once war begins. So according to just war theory, armed conflict must meet the following criteria to be moral. We must have just cause. There must be competent authority. There must be a competent hierarchy and a nation state. We must be motivated by the right intention. War must be a last resort. There must be probability of success. And there must be proportionality of ends. And all of these criteria must be present in order to pursue war. So, when can you go to war? To protect yourself, to protect the state from aggression. Yes. Or humanitarian intervention to protect a third party that cannot protect themselves. These are the only two circumstances. These are the only two circumstances where it's okay, where it's morally justified to go to war. So we have to have the right intention. War must be pursued for one of these causes. You can't wage war for revenge. You can't wage war for territorial acquisition or political expansion. That's immoral. That is not permitted, right? There must be a proper chain of authority. Only nation states, only sovereign nation states have the capacity to wage war. Not non-state actors. And war must be publicly declared, not pursued in secret. Now think about that as a rule. So no clandestine operations. If you're going to use violence to defend yourself, you have to publicly declare that's what you're doing. War must be a last resort. You must exhaust every non-violent objective. Excuse me, you must exhaust every non-violent method to pursue the same objective, right? So, diplomacy, negotiation, economic sanctions, economic blockade, all of these strategies must be pursued exhaustively first. Only then can you engage in warfare. There must be probability of success. It makes no sense. War is destructive. War is a terrible thing. It makes no sense to use violence if there's no chance of prevailing. That would be a waste. All of the killing, all of the suffering would be for nothing. So there must be probability of success. And I think of this criteria, when you think of things like the United States action in Afghanistan. This is why it is important to have clear goals, clearly articulated goals. What is the criteria that we use for success? I think unless you know that, and unless that goal is stated in an understandable way, you should rethink a military intervention. And one of the problems with the intervention in Afghanistan is the war aims, the objectives kept changing. It was to, capture the heads of Al-Qaeda. It was to take out the Taliban. It was to reestablish a working government. It was to create a functional democracy. I mean, come on. You can't ask soldiers to bleed and to die if you're unclear about your stated war aims, because you don't know when you're successful and you don't know when you're failing. Now, problem that also comes up when we think about probability of success is it immoral to resist, say, an occupation where you have little or no chance of success? For example, think of the small European countries that were overrun by the Nazis. The Poles did not have a great chance of success when the Soviet Union and the Germans were dividing up the country. So was it, because resistance was futile, was it immoral? I mean, seriously? When we think about the great sacrifices and the heroic sacrifices made by the Poles who valiantly stood against the Nazis and the Soviets, I don't know. There must be proportionality. The benefits, right, the benefits must, all the possible benefits must be proportional to the death, suffering, and destruction that you cause. So, I mean, if you're going to cause more destruction than you're going to prevent, then no, war is not justified. Now, there's also the jus in bello, and these are the rules for conducting war. Let's say you have a legitimate, you're fighting for self-defense. So what's the jus in bello? Well, these are the rules for conducting war ethically. So you have to discriminate between combatants and civilians. There has to be proportionality of means and ends, and you can't use weapons that are just inherently evil in themselves. So let's look at these criteria. So discrimination, the key requirement here is to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. You cannot target civilians. You can't do that. You cannot directly target civilians. And this has been increasingly an issue as the United States and other countries have fought insurgencies, where it's very, very difficult to tell, the enemy from the civilian population, right? The U.S. drone program was designed to address this problem directly because a drone can loiter for hours over a target, and it was thought that by identifying targets more clearly, you could avoid the kind of casualties that are associated with massed artillery or airstrikes. There must be proportionality, right? One should use only an amount of force that is proportional to the ends being sought. So I think of like soldiers who served in Afghanistan and Iraq have told me stories about, how frustrating the rules of engagement could be when they were taking fire and they had to get permission before they returned fire. But you can't say if you're taking sniper fire from a village, you can't just call artillery down and destroy the whole village. There has to be proportionality of the response. And that kind of makes sense. And finally, there are just some weapons that are off limits, like chemical weapons that have very limited military use, but cause such severe destruction among civilian populations. You cannot use those. And in fact, this prohibition has been fairly successful, although there have been examples like Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against the Kurds in Iraq. Bashir al-Assad has used chemical weapons against his own people during the Syrian civil war. There are reliable accounts that the Russians are using limited chemical weapons in Ukraine in violation of international norms. So yeah, this does happen. But this prohibition has been remarkably successful. I think one of the reasons is because most militaries recognize that chemical weapons are pretty useless on the battlefield. Now there has been a move to ban landmines that has not been successful because and cluster munitions, because unlike chemical weapons, both landmines and cluster munitions are actually pretty useful on the battlefield. So I don't see those going away anytime soon, even though they're responsible for horrific civilian casualties. Now, there is something called the doctrine of double effect you have to know, and this is associated with just war theory. So the doctrine of double effect says that if doing something morally good, if you're doing something that is good and it has a morally bad side effect, something that you didn't intend, but the side effect was bad, right? It's okay to do that as long as the side effect wasn't intended. So even if you foresaw the bad thing would happen, it's okay according to the doctrine of double effect. So if you're going to to bomb an enemy target, and you know that civilians will be killed, but you're not directly targeting those civilians, then the bombing would be okay. So we have a hypothetical here. A submarine captain sees an enemy battleship preparing to shell a friendly city. The captain decides to sink the battleship, even though he knows there are numerous civilians on board. Can he do that and be morally justified? Can he do that? Well, yes, as long as he is not intending for those civilians to die. Even if he knows with a high degree of certainty that they will die, as long as he's not intending for those civilians to die, yes, he can sink that ship. Doctrine of double effect. Now, what about terrorism? What do you guys think? Just war theory, does it allow for terrorism?
Yeah.
No. Yeah, no. Why not? Well, think about it. What
Is it because they treat the civilians as targets?
Yeah, it's completely illegitimate, Nadja. You can't unlike terror. Why do terrorists attack civilians? Because it's easier than attacking a military target, right? And psychologically, it's more horrific. This is not okay. This is not okay. You cannot treat civilians as legitimate targets. That's the first reason that terrorism is prohibited under just war theory. The second reason is most terrorist organizations are non-state actors. There's no legitimate chain of authority. Remember that for just war theorists, only nation states can conduct war, and they have to do it openly. And because there is no structure, no political structure, terrorist groups cannot conduct war morally. Political liberalism / idealism. Now, this refers to an approach to international politics that is guided by ideology. So idealism refers to an approach to politics that seeks to advance certain ideas or moral goals. So there's a unification here between morality and politics. Foreign policy should be directed towards protecting human rights or making the world a more peaceful or just place. That's the bottom line. That we should align our state policy with achieving human rights and or a more peaceful world. So you can see this is completely counter to the political realists who say it's all about power. No, we can try to pursue policies that are good. And we should pursue policies that are morally good. And we know that the current global system can do this. We've seen this work. Through international cooperation, we can have a more peaceful world. We can. We know this. And so because it's possible, we should pursue this. It is true that states pursue their own interests. That is true. But state interest tends to converge on issues like peace and cooperation. It is better for nations to cooperate. It is better for nations to work together than to fight each other. Just like it is better for individuals to cooperate rather than fight. So we should create an international order that that facilitates cooperation and limits warfare. That makes sense. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? War is bad. Everybody agrees war is bad. It has really bad effects. Can it be avoided? Answer, yes. What does it take to avoid war? Cooperation. So maybe we should structure our policy in a more cooperative direction, right? International law is the most effective instrument of achieving peace. We've seen this in action. Idealists believe that human beings have it within their power to change current political arrangements for the better. Even war could be reduced, even eliminated, through the long-term work of forging an effective system of international institutions. We've seen this post-World War II. This has been effective. Now, idealists are not pacifists. They understand that sometimes war might be necessary. If you have an international system, you're going to have not just a carrot, you're going to have a stick. And so when nations violate international norms by, let's say, territorial aggression, those states have to be countered by force. So the only way you can ensure the peace is to have a legitimate deterrent, a military deterrent. And to have a legitimate military deterrent, you have to be willing to go to war. But one way you can avoid conflict is to have collective security. Now, collective security refers to a security arrangement in which multiple states come together. And they make peace and security a common interest. So usually there's some type of treaty, some kind of self-defense treaty. And if you attack one state, then you're attacking all of them. That changes the calculus of war. It makes it far less likely that an aggressor will try violence as a solution. And here a really good example of this is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So to become a NATO member is to commit yourself to defending everyone who's a NATO member, and no one is likely to attack a NATO member because all the other NATO members will come to their defense. And so this is a really good way to ensure that conflicts don't spiral into violence, right? Now, could war be eliminated? The idealists say yes, we just have to change the incentives, and we have been doing this. The last few decades, I know none of you are going to believe this, but the last few decades have been the most peaceful era in human history. Why? The international system. For the first time ever, fewer people die today from human violence than from traffic accidents, obesity, or even suicide. We have made progress. We could even eliminate war by changing the incentives. We just make it too costly to wage war, right? The economic incentives have changed. In the past, if you defeated your enemy on the battlefield, you could easily cash in by looting enemy resources. But today, the main economic assets consist of technical and institutional knowledge. And you can't conquer that. You have to build it. So war doesn't pay off like it used to. Also, quite frankly, in a world of nuclear powers, the potential cost of war is prohibitively high, because even small conflicts could spiral out of control. And if you look at, say, the fighting between India and Pakistan, I think this is a really good example that neither country is willing to push the other to the brink of nuclear war because both countries are nuclear armed. And that changes the calculation, right? Now, what's the problem with this? The problem, I think, is obvious to anyone who reads the paper. The international system that has been created and maintained for the last 70 years is under threat. And all that hard work can be undone very easily. And so now we see an old-fashioned, war of territorial aggression. How do we respond to it? Does war still pay off like it used to? And that is a question that needs to be answered. Is this strong international system stable enough to meet challenges like this? And that's a question that has not been answered yet. Finally, we have pacifism. And pacifism, and get a load of this, folks. Pacifism, pacifists are against war and violence and killing because they're wrong. Because killing is wrong. Because killing is immoral. And so the mass killing of war and other types of conflicts like war is simply morally untenable. Now, pacifism is an umbrella term that encompasses a variety of different types of commitments. But all agree that violence is wrong. Violence is morally objectionable. Pacifism rejects war as an acceptable means of obtaining peace. Some pacifists refuse to serve in the military. Some refuse to support political and social systems that promote war. There are a variety of different types of pacifism. But again, the core idea here is that war is wrong because violence is wrong. There must be another way, right? There must be another way to resolve disputes. Albert Einstein famously was a pacifist. Probably the most famous pacifist of the modern era is Mahatma Gandhi. And unlike the IRA, Gandhi organized active resistance to the British occupation of India through non-violent means at great cost. Many Indians killed in the struggle to liberate India from the British. But Gandhi persisted in the face of violence with his campaign of nonviolence. Says, I object to violence because even when it appears to do good, because the good is only temporary. It's only temporary. The evil that violence does is permanent, lives on forever. Dr. Martin Luther King, who was highly influenced by Gandhi, again modeled his own movement of nonviolence on what Gandhi did in India, very successfully, fighting the laws, the segregation laws in the United States, training his followers to endure blows with batons, had fire hoses turned on them, had dogs, German shepherds unleashed on them, all while demonstrating an absolute commitment to nonviolence. Extraordinary movement, just extraordinary. Now, not everyone at the time supported Dr. King's movement. For example, Malcolm X very famously said, look, we are not a violent people, but you can only take so much. Any rational person can only take so much. And so he famously advocated for self-defense against violence and oppression. He believed that African Americans should use any means necessary to achieve their rights, even if it meant responding to these violent attacks with self-defense, with violence in the name of self-defense. Quote from Malcolm X, we are peaceful people, we are loving people, we love everybody who loves us, but we don't love anybody who doesn't love us. We are nonviolent with people who are nonviolent with us. But we are not nonviolent with anyone who's violent with us. I don't even call it violence when it's self-defense. I call it smart thing to do. Call it intelligence. Now, it is true with Malcolm X that later in his life, his views on violence changed. He continued to advocate for justice and equality, but he recognized that violence was not the path to achieve that, or at the very least, was problematic. So he came to believe in a more nuanced approach. Yes, one that did include self-defense, but also education and political action. Problems with pacifism. It's not clear to me that pacifism can be a legitimate deterrence to violence. In what way can pacifism be a deterrent? It doesn't seem like it can. I mean, if one party knows that you're not going to fight back, isn't that an incentive for that party to use violence against you? I'm not sure that the pacifists have a coherent response to terrorism. People who are willing to target civilian populations to get what they want politically, ideologically. I don't think you're going to convince them with a highly principled moral argument rooted in pacifism that violence is wrong. If you're willing to, put a bomb on a bus filled with people, I don't know that pacifism is going to have much of an effect on you. And then think about humanitarian interventions all around the world where people are massacred, people are killed. Isn't there a moral obligation to intervene militarily when those types of things occur? And this brings us, of course, to the Rwanda genocide. In the mid-1990s, over a 100-day period, approximately 500,000 to 1 million Rwandans were killed, mostly by machete. And it's a complicated story. It's a story of two ethnic groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis, who had a lingering animosity. But that, of course, is a great simplification. There are many people who argue that that these distinctions between the Hutu and the Tutsis were exacerbated by the Belgian colonization of Rwanda. So it's a complicated history for sure, but the numbers are clear. You know, by best estimates, about 800,000 Tutsis were killed, murdered, after the assassination of the president of Rwanda. And the president of Rwanda was assassinated in kind of mysterious circumstances, and the Hutus blamed the Tutsis. And of course, that was just a pretext for what happened. But the reality is that about 800,000 Tutsis died horribly. While the world watched, the United Nations, France, Belgium, the United States, all the great powers watched and did nothing. And I encourage you guys to watch Hotel Rwanda. Yes, it is a simplification of the events, but Don Cheadle plays a guy named Paul Rusesabagina, and he's a real guy. I've seen him speak before. And he was a hotel manager at the Hotel de Micheline, which was a foreign-owned luxury hotel in Rwanda. And when the massacre began, Paul Rusesabagina was a Hutu, and his wife was a Tutsi, and his Tutsi neighbors came to him for protection, and at first he was reluctant. But then over time, he began to shelter them, and he took them to the hotel, and he saved over 2,000 people. But during the massacre, there were UN forces in Rwanda. And Rusesabagina, he describes this. He's in talking to the colonel who was in charge of the UN forces. He said, I'm not worried because I know that the UN will protect us, that France will come, that Belgium will come, that the Americans will come. As these gangs of Interahamwe militia fighters began to hack people to death with machetes, the UN was there, and the UN watched this happen. And there's a very telling scene in the movie where the UN colonel tells Rusesabagina, we're not going to do anything. We're not coming. They did come, but they came only to rescue the European tourists who were at the hotel. That the Africans there had to stay. And in retrospect, it would have taken very little force, or even just a show of force from the UN or the United States or anyone else to show up, and the massacres would have stopped. Doesn't this suggest that there's some kind of moral obligation to intervene? And in 1998, during a visit to Rwanda, President Bill Clinton, who was president at the time of the massacres, formally apologized for the United States' failure to act during the genocide, during the killings, acknowledging the moral responsibility that the US and other nations had to prevent these types of atrocities? And so that's an interesting question to leave with. Do strong countries, do powerful countries have a moral obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves using violence? And that's something that we can think about. All right. I know that was a lot. That's a lot to think about. And I appreciate it. And I know that, yes, some of these ideas are very disturbing, but I appreciate you hanging in there with me. And I thank you so much for spending this time with me. Hector?
Oh yeah, I had a question.